So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. And for those who are also online, welcome to all of you. My name is Ilan Kelman. I'm here at University College London as Professor of Disasters and Health, half at the Institute for Global Health, half at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. And I also have the pleasure of being first supervisor for Miles Harris, PhD, which he wonderfully passed his viva. So we're looking forward to him becoming a full-time member of our staff at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. Because during his PhD, Miles did absolutely amazing work, not only setting up the company, Space Health Research, not only setting up the research group, which was Space Health Risks, and we're looking at how to deal with that further, but in particular, it was also thinking about the first UK analog mission, and we're going to hear more about his work today in the wonderful seminar which he and others have put together, Our Off-World Future. Part of this is coming from UCL, University College London, and part is also coming from HSC, the Human Security Centre. And I now hand over to Rowan Alport, who's in Sheffield, to introduce HSC. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us wherever you are today. I'm Rowan Alport, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Human Security Centre. We're a London-based think tank, which is jointly organising and running tonight's event with UCL. To provide some context for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with the concept, human security as a concept advanced by our organisation is a notion of sort of human security that goes beyond traditional state and military defence. It emphasises the protection of individuals and communities, considers their diverse needs, including personal safety, access to basic necessities, healthcare, education, and freedom from fear and want. Now, as we embark on this unprecedented journey into space, it is imperative to consider human security as a fundamental aspect. The boundless expanse of space presents us with almost limitless options, but it also provides formidable challenges, especially concerning the safety and well-being of those venturing into uncharted territory. There is also the bigger picture. Creating self-sustaining communities beyond Earth is arguably the logical endpoint of human security, and that it improves the overall resilience of the human race by no longer placing the fate of civilization in one location. To be clear, this is in no way, shape, or form to disregard developments on Earth or the fate of its inhabitants, as is perhaps portrayed in much dystopian science fiction. Indeed, it's quite the opposite. As space settlements present the opportunity for a positive feedback loop, what we can learn living off-world can be applied to find solutions to Earth-based challenges. The concept of human security encompasses not only physical safety, but also mental, society, and environmental well-being. As we set our sights on establishing colonies and bases beyond Earth, ensuring the protection of individuals within these extraterrestrial habitats becomes paramount. The harsh and unforgiving conditions of space demand meticulous planning and innovation to safeguard our pioneers. Rigorous safety protocols, advanced technology, and continuous risk assessment are pivotal in mitigating the inherent dangers of space travel and habitation. Whether it's shielding against cosmic radiation, designing resilient life support systems, or creating fail-safes for emergencies, prioritizing human security from all the pressures, including the political and commercial factors that are likely to encroach on this area, is non-negotiable. Furthermore, the social dynamics within space communities necessitate frameworks that uphold human rights, equality, and inclusivity. Creating a harmonious and equitable environment where every individual's dignity and rights are respected fosters a cohesive society is critical for long-term survival and progress. In conclusion, the pursuit of space colonization is a monumental endeavor that demands our unwavering commitment to human security. It compels us to push the boundaries of innovation, empathy, and cooperation. By prioritizing the safety, well-being, and dignity of those venturing into the cosmos, we not only advance our presence beyond Earth, but also set the foundations for a future where human security remains a cornerstone of our endeavors. We've got an incredible group of speakers tonight. I'd like to thank them in advance for giving us their time, and without further ado, I'll pass back.
So thank you so much. And again, thank you to Rowan and HSC for supporting us in this work and our continuing approaches to ensuring that space-related research, particularly from the social sciences, but really all disciplines, really makes its mark with the really exciting research that our panel today is presenting. It's wonderful to see the number of attendees online ticking up. So I'll just now go over the housekeeping that you'll see the chat is disabled, but please do put your comments and questions in the Q&A, which I'll be monitoring. We already had one question in there, which I hope I answered adequately. Otherwise, you can see that this is being recorded. So for those who are in the room when you are speaking and asking questions, this will be recorded and we will put it on the YouTube channel. So I'm now delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Erica Nesvold, who is an astrophysicist and ethicist and author of Off-World, ethical questions and quandaries for living in outer space. Thank you so much, Erica.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm just going to start things off today by talking about why it's so important for us to be looking closely at what our motivations are for space settlement. So just to note, in this talk, I'm going to be switching back and forth between saying we and our and saying space settlement advocates to refer to this community of people who think we should settle space. I do consider myself a proponent of human space settlement, but at the same time, I also do a lot of work in criticizing specific plans for space settlement and pointing out different challenges and risks of various aspects of space settlement. So let me just start off by quickly telling you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from. I'm an astrophysicist by training and experience, and in fact, that's still my day job. When I'm not giving talks in the middle of my day, I spend my days writing computer simulations of space. But several years ago, I got very interested in thinking about the ethical and human rights challenges that we'll be facing as we expand our civilization into space, much like it sounds like the Human Security Center is. But I also recognized early on in that thought process that most people working in space settlement, not all certainly, but many of the people I encountered, including myself, are primarily trained in a STEM background. So we're scientists and engineers, and depending on what education system we came from, we're generally not well trained. We don't have a lot of education in things like colonial history or the sociology of small communities and extreme environments, or even things like how to frame ethical arguments and then apply them to policy and law, the sorts of things that would be useful when planning for a future in space. So I started my personal journey by creating a podcast called Making New Worlds, where I interviewed experts in things like history, sociology, anthropology, law, philosophy, many of whom had never even considered their work in the context of space, but had a lot to offer in terms of parallels from history on Earth and how we could apply that in space. More recently, I've expanded that into a book called Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space, which came out this year. And along the way, I also co-founded a nonprofit called the Just Space Alliance, which I co-founded with another astronomer, and we advocate for a more ethical and inclusive future in space and try to harness people's excitement for space to get them to think about these kinds of human rights issues that are happening here on Earth today. So why do we need to worry about ethics in space? Perhaps I'm preaching to the choir a bit here, but advocates for human space settlement, many of them like to talk about space as this blank slate where we can go and create new societies from scratch, even utopias. And of course, space certainly looks like a blank slate at the moment because the only thing you can find up there from Earth is a handful of robots. But once the first generation of settlers gets to space, it won't be a blank slate. They won't be a blank slate. When humans get there, we'll be bringing all of our biases, our values, our vices, and our needs with us. So we need to make sure that we're figuring out as early as we can, developing solutions to more than just the technological and financial challenges, which are also quite impressive, but also the ethical and human rights and social challenges as well. As I mentioned, though, we can learn from history and the social sciences in an effort to, at the very least, try to avoid repeating the mistakes and the harms and the structural problems from the past and present on Earth, and avoid repeating those mistakes in the future in space. So my work involves looking at these historical parallels on Earth and trying to figure out the kinds of challenges we'll face in space and what we can learn and apply from the past. So that includes things like governance, which I think we'll be hearing about later, specific things like labor rights or criminal justice, and even much farther in the future, I do some writing on things like reproductive rights or population control in space. But today I was asked to focus on one key question, which is a question that we need to ask before we can really truly answer any of these other questions, which is, why do we want to settle space? Note that I'm not saying, why should we settle space? This isn't a talk where I'm trying to convince anyone about human space settlement here. And I'm not here to argue the correctness of different arguments for space settlement. I do that elsewhere. I think all of us at some point or another debate the individual arguments for space settlement. And in fact, if you ask 5 different space settlement advocates why we should settle space, you'll get 10 different answers. But suppose we're not actually trying to do any advocacy. Suppose you're sitting in a room with a group of people, everyone present agrees that humans should settle space, what does it matter if maybe their motivations and their answers to this question aren't all the same? Well, the reason it matters is that our motivations for this kind of enormous, complex undertaking that's going to take multiple generations, our motivations are going to determine the kinds of decisions that we make along the way that we answer all the other questions that we're going to encounter during space settlement. And that's because each of these different possible motivations represents and carries with it a different set of priorities and values, and thus a different kinds of risks and challenges that we're more likely to run into. So I just want to go through a few of the more commonly referenced whys that I've encountered in reading and studying the rhetoric in a lot of space settlement advocacy, and just kind of talk about how each different motivation might affect our decisions differently, and what kinds of risks each of these motivations could bring along with it, just to show you why this exercise is useful. So the big one, which was already mentioned, the very common reason brought up is for the long-term survival of our species. So the argument here is that our species is currently completely dependent on our home planet and its resources. Even the astronauts who are living in space right now, if the Earth was no longer habitable, they wouldn't last too long. So the idea is that if we can establish some kind of independent, permanent, self-sustaining settlement away from Earth, then a catastrophe that makes the Earth uninhabitable for humans wouldn't necessarily result in the full extinction of our species. And this includes catastrophes like a completely deadly pandemic that wipes off all humans and leaves the Earth alone, but it also includes anything that changes the Earth's biosphere in a way that makes it no longer habitable. If we've constructed a biosphere somewhere else, then perhaps we can save ourselves. Now, the risks inherent in this argument, and this argument is very widespread, as I mentioned, I find it particularly convincing, but it carries some risks that will affect the ethics and the kinds of decisions you'll make. And one of the big risks that I see a lot is that the stakes in this argument are incredibly high. It's about the long-term survival of our species, which means if you're worried about the methods that we go about maintaining the survival of our species, you can easily fall into the traps of saying the ends justify the means. And when the stakes are this high, then you can justify almost any means because you're talking about the survival of our species. And unfortunately, this can lead to a lot of really false dichotomies when people take shortcuts in these debates. These false dichotomies in, well, you have to agree with my proposal for settling space because if you don't, then the asteroid's going to hit Earth and wipe us all out and everybody dies. Which is not a great way to debate the merits of different plans. Even if this dichotomy was true, even if there was one specific way that could save humanity and everything else would fail, we still need to take the time to think about a more difficult question, which is at what point is the survival of the human race not worth it? Can you imagine some kind of really miserable, awful dystopian scenario of humans living off-world? They're surviving the human race. Is there any situation in which you would say that survival is not worth it? Some people would say no, any survival is worth any scenario, but this is the kinds of debates that philosophers have been having for generations, and this is the sorts of things we need to think about to make sure we're not falling into these kinds of traps. Now, the next motivation that I encounter a lot in space settlement rhetoric, I'm swinging to another side of the spectrum here, is the idea that you can make a lot of money by settling space, or at the very least, space settlement would support new industries that could make a lot of people a lot of money. The argument here, of course, is that space contains a lot of valuable resources. You can either sell those resources to other humans living in space, which means you need humans to be living in space, or you can sell them back to Earth. And this includes tangible resources like water ice or rare minerals that you could get out of asteroids, but it also includes the fundamental things about the space environment. Low Earth orbit is a valuable resource because of its positioning. Space solar power has been proposed, and that takes some geometric benefits from space. But regardless, the argument that's often used for including these profit motivations in space settlement is that this potential for profit, the potential for massive profit, it's been proposed that the world's first trillionaire might be an asteroid miner. This potential can encourage and stimulate innovation because people will be more motivated to take risks to develop technologies that can enable space settlement, bring costs down. Of course, that's the argument for reusable rocket boosters. And so people looking to profit from space settlement will benefit from space settlement, but the argument goes, of course, that space settlement will also benefit from getting these profit seekers involved in the efforts to settle space, even if those profit seekers don't necessarily care about the rest of these arguments. Now, of course, it's fairly easy to imagine some of the potential risks of profit seeking as a motive for space, because we've seen profit seeking industries cause certain harms on Earth. So the incentive for making a lot of money tends to incentivize things like labor exploitation, cutting corners on safety measures, et cetera. And so this particular motivation can lead to a lot of risks when it comes to labor rights. It also can result in cutting corners when it comes to environmental sustainability and overuse of environmental resources. There's also a concern, if we do create humanity's first trillionaire in space, that this is only going to exacerbate the existing inequality that we see on Earth, and that seems to be increasing between the people who are very rich and the people who are very poor. As they separate, if we add this new valuable resource to the mix that only some people have access to, or that only some people can make a profit from, then we're just going to exacerbate this inequality. And there's a lot of discussion right now about how the benefits and costs of the space environment should be distributed equitably amongst humanity, or whether they shouldn't. So that's an ongoing debate now as well. Another motivation that I have seen quite a lot, and I'm sure you have as well, in arguments for space settlement reaching back decades, is the argument that it is somehow humanity's destiny. And if you're talking to Americans, there tends to be a flavor of manifest destiny in there as well. And so Americans tend to like to point to the European colonization of North America as a good thing, a goal we should strive for, because it's how our country came about, and a lot of people made money, and it was a nation building exercise. And so that's often pointed to as a parallel. At the same time, colonization is a difficult term within this community, which is why I use space settlement instead of space colonization. And the reason for that is that colonization on Earth caused a lot of harms to the people who were being colonized. Others say, well, what's the problem with the word colonization for space? Because as far as we know, there's no indigenous life in space for us to harm this time. So therefore, there's no problem with the idea of colonization. But there are some risks with this manifest destiny approach and the mindset inherent in colonization, which says that these resources and this territory are sitting there waiting for us to use them. Whether you believe they're given by God or are humanity's destiny, it tends to encourage the consumption of those resources and of that territory without thinking about things like ethics. And so this can lead to things like environmental overuse and destruction, which we see, we're all still living with the legacy of colonization when it comes to the damage that it did to our environment. And I'll note that even though, as far as we know, there's no indigenous life in space to harm, historically, colonization also caused a lot of harm to individuals who weren't in the colonized people, but who were brought along for labor exploitation. So that includes, of course, the slave trade, but also all of the different systems that were set up for labor exploitation in North America. There's a plethora of examples. And the reason for that is because that kind of consumption of a new territory and its resources tends to be very labor intensive. It's been argued that a labor shortage in space will mean that laborers are valued and can negotiate for higher wages. And because they'll be in demand, they can make more demands. But historically in North America during colonization, labor shortages meant that people invented new ways to exploit labor. And so that is a risk as well that we need to, at the very least, think about and keep an eye out for as we move forward. Related to this idea of we have to settle space because it's our destiny is an argument about progress. And so this is an argument that says that continued never-ending progress and growth and expansion of our species and its economy are not just inevitable, but necessary, because if we don't continue to grow, then humanity will stagnate, and this is a bad thing because stagnation is bad. That's the very simplified version of the argument. And you can see historical parallels to this that were occurring during the colonization of North America. But of course, much of our economy today is based on the idea of increased growth at all times. And so it's easy to see how this could be extended into space as we reach the limits of our environment and resources on this planet. But of course, there are risks with this idea of never-ending progress. The most obvious one is that this mindset will just continue a pattern of environmental destruction. We will expand, we'll use up the resources where we are, we'll need to expand farther. And in a universe where we can continue to expand infinitely, perhaps that's not a practical problem, but in real life, we will have fits and starts of this expansion, and it behooves us to learn at the very least how to live sustainably with the given environment that we're in, even if we're also planning for expansion in the future. And this is especially important in space because we have to be able to develop artificial ecosystems that are more circular and more sustainable and aren't infinitely growing. And so in order to be able to develop those technologies, we can't just keep saying, oh, we'll just get bigger and bigger all the time. So that's a risk of pursuing space settlement purely for the idea of never-ending expansion. Is you need both. You need the idea of sustainability, and you need to be thinking about growth in the future as well. Now, the next motivation I'm going to point to is one that you never see actually written down in books or marketing material, but I argue that it is frequently present nonetheless. And that is just emotion, the idea that people want us to settle space because they want us to settle space. They love the idea of it. They love space. They love the idea of them personally living in space. And so no one is trying to point to that and say, we should settle space because I want to. But that is certainly a widespread motivation for many individual people, including myself, who are working on space. Usually it's accompanied by one of these other more logical arguments, but it's there as well. And so we need to acknowledge it. And the reason we need to acknowledge it, there's certainly nothing wrong with being motivated by a passion for space, but you need to be aware of it so that you can identify when you're making decisions based on emotion rather than some rational reasons. I've also observed that the emotion that people feel about space and about space settlement tends to lead them to be more dismissive of perhaps valid criticisms than they would be if they were thinking with a more clear head. And so again, it's not bad to be motivated by passion and for love for space. It's just important to acknowledge it and to be constantly interrogating your decisions and seeing whether they're motivated by emotion or by some other reason. A couple of other common reasons that I see, these two are usually used more to argue for space exploration than space settlement, but you see them in space settlement arguments as well. One is the idea of scientific research and increased understanding of our universe. Certainly human space settlement will allow for in situ research in planetary science because humans will be living in these environments that we've been trying to study remotely for so long. But then you also could get a lot of biological research out of studying the settlers themselves, human scientific research. You can study their crops and agriculture. You can build biology and chemistry labs in space and in these different gravity environments and get a lot of science done that you wouldn't be able to get done on Earth. The big debate in this camp, of course, is whether you really need humans on site for that or whether it would be cheaper and thus more effective and efficient to just continue to use robots to perform science in space. The risks of this kind of argument are that this could lead to, or at least contribute to, a lot of potential land use conflicts that people are already starting to foresee in places like Mars or the moon. If scientists want to build a radio telescope in a crater on the far side of the moon, but someone wants to mine the ice out of that crater, or they want to build a launch pad that's going to kick up a lot of dust and be thrown onto that telescope, that's going to lead to the same kind of conflicts that everyone else is going to have. With scientists in particular, I foresee that there's going to be, in particular, a lot of debates over the importance of planetary protection, which scientists rank very highly in importance. They want to make sure, especially if astrobiologists go to a certain site in space, they want to ensure, as they're looking for life in that region that the area hasn't been contaminated by Earth life from some other humans who have been traipsing around. And we have some guidelines on that, and planetary scientists and astrobiologists have been ahead of the game because they're the ones building the rovers and such. And so they've been able to really make sure everyone's following these guidelines as more different groups with different motivations are going farther and farther out into space. This conflict is going to come up a lot more. The other reason I'll mention is that while the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 forbids national appropriation of territory in space, there are, of course, still plenty of arguments involving military posture or national interests, even beyond Earth orbit, where this ridiculous artwork is taking place. Certainly, as far as I know, the US government hasn't been saying we need to build a permanent human space settlement on the moon for the sake of America. But the rhetoric around things like the Artemis Accords or China's plans for space does certainly, if you look at it, include a sense of, well, we need to establish our presence there first to safeguard our interests and values, because if the other guy gets there first, then we've lost that foothold. So I think as more of industry and science moves out into space, perhaps even with more of a human presence there, there's going to be more military and national interests out there as well. Of course, the risks with this motivation are obvious, as they were obvious to the writers of the Outer Space Treaty, that it's just going to increase the risks of conflicts that then turn into violence and war. So this is just a quick handful of potential motivations that I've seen. You can probably think of several others yourself, but hopefully at the very least you can see the value of this kind of exercise. Again, I'm not trying to, in this talk, I haven't been trying to criticize the correctness of any of these, but you can see how different motivations can produce different pathways in decision-making and also different risks. So in my last few minutes, I want to talk about another useful exercise, and that is to step back and ask another question that I know that some space settlement advocates feel perhaps fairly dismissive of, and that's this question of whether we should settle space at all. To be clear, again, personally, I think that we should, but as most of you are probably aware, there are a number of people in this public debate who argue that no, we shouldn't settle space. Either people who say we should never settle space, which is a fairly extreme form of this argument, or more commonly what you see is people arguing that we shouldn't settle space right now, that we should wait. And this often comes up against the idea of people who are saying we need to start this process as soon as possible because of the existential risk concern. But the idea is of these people who say we need to wait, it's usually an argument saying that we're not ready yet as a species somehow. Either we're not mature enough, or we haven't worked out the problems that we need to work out here on Earth. You've all heard variations of this idea. And in fact, the argument that we shouldn't settle space right now because we should be spending those resources, the money and efforts on something else, this goes back to the Poor People's Campaign, who protested the Apollo 11 launch. That's what this photo is of back in the 60s. And while I personally think that there's a common false dichotomy that comes up in these arguments, that either we can feed starving children or we can go to the moon. There's no in between. I believe that's a false dichotomy, and I believe that our activities in space can benefit people here on Earth if we make an effort to. I do also think that especially the parts of space settlement that are government funded or government subsidized with public money, that I believe that we should have this debate and continue to have this debate. I also think it's important and practically very useful to engage in conversations with people who don't believe that we should settle space, either ever or right now, rather than simply dismissing them as Luddites. And the practical reason is that they often present really potentially valid criticisms that space settlement advocates should be thinking about as we continue to make our plans for space. So I'll give you just a couple examples of these potentially valid criticisms. One is the argument that we shouldn't settle space because it will cost us more in damage to the Earth's environment than we would gain in terms of benefits to the Earth's environment, because there's a lot of environmental arguments for space settlement. We can move our heavy industry off planet, we can relieve population pressures, etc. But there are concerns, especially every time a rocket blows up on a launch pad. This is a picture of some debris in Boca Chica, Texas, after not the last, but the one before it, SpaceX attempt at launch. And so anytime there's some kind of explosive event in the space industry, this argument tends to come up again. But it also, there's an undercurrent of this, not just about exploding rockets at launch sites, which tend to be a more local event, but there's discussion about whether rocket launches as a whole are contributing to damage to the atmosphere, or whether the space industry as a whole in its consumption of resources and energy, whether those could be spent better in some other way that's less damaging to the environment. And again, while I've seen some space settlement advocates be just immediately very dismissive of this idea because they have in their head this idea that they're going to save the Earth by expanding into space, I do also believe that we should be estimating constantly and keeping an eye on the environmental costs of our work. Sure, we all want to save the planet in the long term, but that doesn't give us a license to just do whatever we want in the short term. There's a middle ground where we can try to be as protective of the environment as possible as we pursue this idea of human space settlement. Another example of a potentially useful criticism is the argument that we shouldn't settle space because settling space would increase the existential risks to humanity more than it would decrease them. So most recently, the discussion I see around this is around Daniel Dudney's book, Dark Skies, which came out a couple of years ago. He's a political scientist, and his argument is that space settlement and increased human activity in space would shift various balances in space and around the world and give us technologies that would increase our risk for nuclear war, while at the same time he doesn't believe the arguments that space settlement would improve our survival rates if there was a global catastrophe, because he's not convinced we can come up with a sustainable space settlement to save humanity. And so his risk-benefit analysis tells him, we should not pursue space settlement because it's more likely to kill us than it is to save us. So again, whether you agree with Dudney's arguments in particular or not, I also believe that space settlement advocates should be thinking about the potential unintentional consequences of all of the new technologies that we're working on and their social ramifications and how they will shift the balance of various social interactions that are happening here on Earth today. And to do things like that, we need to not just be consulting the engineers who are developing these technologies, but we also need to be talking to experts in international relations and policymakers. So just to wrap things up so that we can move on to the next two talks, which I'm very interested in. To summarize, space settlement advocates have, if you ask them, a wide variety of different motivations for why they think humanity should settle space. And the exercise of interrogating these motivations is a really useful one, partly because the different motivations will produce different priorities, different design requirements for engineers, and also different risks and challenges that we need to plan for. I'll also note that even within an organization where everyone agrees on the importance of space settlement, if there's different motivations within that organization, that could potentially lead to conflict later as these decisions are getting made. I also argued that engaging with critics of space settlement is another useful exercise because critics are well positioned to identify weak arguments coming out of space settlement advocacy, or at the very least for identifying understudied risks that we could all do a better job of thinking about. So I will just stop there.
Thanks so much. Please, round of applause. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We do have time for perhaps one question in the room and one question online. So again, people online, please use the Q&A. The chat is disabled. Do we have any questions to start off in the room? And I'll wait a bit for a Q&A online.
That's all right. I'll be around for the Q&A later too, if someone thinks of a question.
Well, if I may sort of jump in then, I'm curious, Erica, what do you think then about other countries or many countries perhaps staking their claim for space and perhaps their interest in settling space to have their own perspectives, their own politics, their own cultures?
Personally, I encourage it. I am not an American who thinks that Americans are right about everything. And I also think that there are a number of people who are excited about space because they want to try out new systems of living together, and ways of building communities that don't exist on Earth today in any of these nations. And so, to me, the larger the number of different people who have access to and the ability to attempt to create communities in space, the better. Some of them will work better than others, but it's better than, again, putting all of our eggs in one basket.
Okay, thank you. We do have one question in the chat. A lot of input there. What is the most surprisingly useful question you have heard? And I guess maybe you've given this talk a lot, you have your book, you're doing absolutely wonderful work. Perhaps you could articulate what is the most useful or best or surprising question that you've had.
That's a great question. I should probably have written them down when I came across them. I will say that I find, maybe this is just the scientist in me, I find that discussing these issues with people who vehemently disagree with my thoughts on space settlement has been the most useful for me. And that includes both people who don't think we should ever settle space, which I don't agree with, but I love having conversations with those people. And it includes people who have just a very different vision of what humanity's future in space should be. I think those conversations are always educational for both sides, assuming that both sides are engaging in good faith.
Okay, that's wonderful. Another round of applause for Erica's wonderful job.
Thank you.
So now we move on to our second speaker, and Miles Harris is Associate Lecturer and Off-World Living Institute Lead at UCL University College London, where we come from today. He is also CEO and founder of Space Health Research. Miles.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that really nice introduction, Ilan. I'm really pleased to see lots of familiar faces in the room. Thank you for coming along, and thank you to those online as well. Thank you also to Erica for your presentation. You made some really interesting points and thought-provoking questions during your presentation, so I really enjoyed it. And I'm really looking forward to Robert's presentation in about 30 minutes' time. For my presentation, I've taken a different spin on off-world futures, which is looking at the concept of space exploration in the UK. So I'm going to share some information about my background and how I've ended up working in this area. And then also I've got lots of photos and material to show you from the projects that we've been working on. And I've also got members of my team in the room as well. And I'm going to invite them to share some of their experiences within this presentation as well. So to begin with then, a little introduction about me. By background, I'm a nurse. Most of my clinical practice was not in a hospital, although I did work for a short amount of time in the emergency department. It was mostly environments like this. So this is up in the Nepalese Himalayas at about 5,800, 900 meters. And this was our hospital tent, if you like. You can see that it's relatively small in comparison to an emergency department. And the resources that we had available to us are literally in front of the tent, so only what we could carry. So my clinical experience really is in this very remote environment, not just at the extreme altitude, but in a variety of different mountaineering expeditions as well. So I haven't just done this as a clinical practitioner, I've also done this as a research assistant. So on this expedition, we were running a study for the British military, looking at how substances can be used to improve performance at high altitude. And the substance that we were testing was beetroot shots. And beetroot shots have a high amount of nitrate in them. And that, in theory, was increasing the body's ability to absorb and use oxygen in high altitude. And my colleague here, Anna, was the lead for this study, which was really, really interesting results. However, I moved away from nursing and did a master's in education. So I've also trained nurses and worked on a project for the UK government about a new nursing profession called nursing associates. So not only have I worked in environments like this, but also worked in an education setting. And for my PhD, I wanted to bring these concepts together to look at health in these very remote environments and how do we prepare to manage these risks when we're in these environments like this. So this is another photo that I took a few years ago. So these are the sorts of environments that I like hanging out in. Pun is intentional. So this is my climbing partner, Joe, and I was on the other rope. This was a glacier in Iceland. So we were doing some training about crevasse rescues and ice climbing and these sorts of activities. So it's these sorts of environments that I find really interesting. And how do we manage the risks when we're in these sorts of environments? And you're probably thinking at this point, well, there's a lot of risks to manage here. And you'd be absolutely right about that. Not only is it exceptionally cold, you're on a very steep slope. And what the picture doesn't show you here is that there's a very large drop beneath us at this point. So there's a huge amount of risks that we need to manage in these environments. And the current research that looks at risk to health and other wider risks in these environments, including space, is currently quite compartmentalized. And I wanted to take a different approach to this and to look at risks from a more holistic perspective. So in my PhD, I collaborated with the British military and also a civilian organization called Remote Area Risk International. And they are a risk consultancy and an education provider about operating in environments like this. So we collaborated together to develop a theory of how to mitigate the risks to health in environments such as this, but also during military deployment to humanitarian responses, but then also during civilian expeditions as well. During my PhD, I tested this theory. And plan A was originally to go to Pakistan and to do an expedition there and to see how this theory is used in practice. But then something called COVID came along and threw that completely out the window, which was a blessing and a curse, because it allowed me the space and the time to think about a different remote environment. And that remote environment is space. So as Alan kindly mentioned in the introduction, we founded a research group here at UCL called the Space Health Risks Research Group. This is a multidisciplinary community of researchers and practitioners who come together to investigate some of these concepts. So risks from different perspectives, not just medical risks, but psychological risks and others as well. So one thing that we worked on was the design of something called an analog mission. And analog missions is something I'm going to come on to later on. And essentially, the analog mission that we decided to do simulated the human exploration of another planet. We theoretically explored how could we manage the risks and mitigate those risks during a human space flight and an EVA on another planet. And the short answer is it's really complicated. But we really wanted to pull that thread and to investigate that more. And the way we did that was we designed a pilot analog mission and deployed it to see whether we could investigate these kind of concepts. And later in the presentation, I'm going to show you lots of photos and videos from this location and tell you a little bit more about it. One of the key questions that we wanted to ask was, can the UK be used to simulate space exploration? You may think, well, what's the UK got to do with space? Most space activity is in other locations, although we are getting better in the UK about space activity. The first image I have here, I didn't take. This was taken by the Mars rover Curiosity. And this is a recent photo of the surface of Mars. But you could, in another way, look at this and think, well, that could be somewhere like the Iranian desert or somewhere in the Middle East like Afghanistan. The point here that I'm trying to make is there are locations on the moon and on Mars that are very similar to the topography or the lay of the land that we have here, here in the UK and on planet Earth. So, as I said earlier, we pulled that thread and we thought, well, maybe if we went to a location that has a similar environment to Mars and the moon, we could do some research. And we started looking around. And originally the plan A for plan B, if you like, was to go to the Cairngorm National Park high up in the Highlands of Scotland, which is a subarctic plateau. For those of you who haven't been there, it's a very remote and harsh environment. And we were going to go to the remotest part of the Cairngorm National Park. We contacted the landowners to say we want to do some research here. And they were very supportive and said, we would love you to do that. But unfortunately, some very rare ground nesting birds had moved into that location. And we didn't want to upset the birds. So we had to look for another location. And we came across this environment. And this environment is a remote and uninhabited island on the west coast of Scotland. And going back to the previous image, you can see that there's mountains and hills and lowlands in the background, and grassy, or what would have been potentially grassy plains, or what could be grassy plains eventually in the future. So there are some analogies to this location and other planets. Interestingly, very recently, NASA came to the UK to another island, not this one, but an island close by, to collect some rock samples, because some rocks on this particular island, in this island chain, are very similar to rocks on the moon. So they wanted to do some sampling. So this is evidence that there is some suggestion that we could simulate space here in the UK. So we decided to do it. And we decided to deploy a pilot analog mission to this island on the west coast of Scotland. And if you focus your eye on right in the middle of the screen, you'll see a lighter green blob. And this was our analog astronaut base camp during the pilot analog mission. So we put a group of people on this island to see whether this could be used as a location to simulate an EVA, or an extravehicular activity, for a period of time, and to do activities that astronauts do in space as well, so do a program of research. And the short answer to this is we could do it. We successfully simulated a space mission to another planet and to do some research. This, however, was a pilot mission. And the success of that mission left us wanting more. So the team that we had at the time sat around the table and said, we do want to do this again and involve more people, do more research, and do it for longer. So the way that we did that was to form an independent organization called Space Health Research, to a spin out from the research group, as an organization that specializes in these type of analog missions that simulate the exploration of space by using natural environments like we have here, that have analogies with outer space. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of analog missions, but for those of you that aren't, analog missions are a way of simulating aspects of space. And you're probably more familiar with analog missions than you originally think. You may have seen parabolic flights, or what's colloquially known as the Vomit comics, where an airplane flies up into the atmosphere and comes down really quickly. And it gives those on board the simulation of zero gravity for a few minutes. And this is a really useful field site for conducting research about how the body physically responds to being in zero gravity. Every analog mission, though, simulates something slightly different. There is no perfect analog mission. There's 100% fidelity or realism to space. Is called being in space. So other types of analog missions are diving analog missions. So living underwater for a period of time. It's an atmosphere that you can't breathe. You're in a semi-weightless environment as well. So it's a perfect analog for that kind of analog mission, of space simulation. We didn't do any of those things. As I said, we simulated the human exploration of another planet. And based on the findings and the lessons that we learned from the pilot mission, we designed a new analog mission that lasted for 2 weeks. We went to the same location, and that mission was called Meili 1. And for those of you who don't speak ancient Greek, Meili was the god of exploration and the feeling of being in the unknown. And that was a real appropriate name for the mission, because we weren't sure whether we could do this for a full-length mission. So we spent about 12 to 18 months rigorously planning this analog mission, designing what risks we were putting people in reality, and then also what we were doing within the simulation. And that analog mission design is based on research that's been published about the safety and management in analog missions, which is a really interesting read. I encourage you to do that. So the fieldwork site, as I said, is a remote and uninhabited island on the west coast of Scotland. Again, for those who haven't been to Scotland, it's not known for its sunny, glorious weather. It's often quite challenging environments. And this particular island is located far enough out that certain parts of the island on the west coast are exposed to all of the weather that builds up in the Atlantic and throws itself at the west coast of Scotland. So it can be really challenging. The defining features of this location are it's quite difficult to get to, and therefore it's very difficult to get people off if an actual injury or illness takes place. That's exactly the same as being in space. Astronauts on the International Space Station, if they are unwell, it does take a long time to get them back, 24 hours roughly. The counter argument to that is there are locations on planet Earth that are arguably more remote than the International Space Station. I've got colleagues in the room who know a lot about working in Antarctica, where over winter you can be stuck there for 8 months because the conditions are so severe that you just can't be evacuated. So this is another piece of evidence that says that we can accurately simulate space exploration here on Earth. But another defining feature of this location is that to get to this location, you can only get there by water. You could possibly land a helicopter in one defined location, but because the weather is so bad so often, it's almost a write-off, but you can't get a helicopter. So the only other option is to go via a powerboat. And the powerboat to get there is relatively small, and that therefore limits the amount of resources that we can take. Again, this is very similar to going into space, onto the International Space Station, onto the Moon, and eventually Mars, where you've only got a defined limited payload, because it costs a lot of money to put things in space, and there's a limited physical space on these rockets. So this is another defining feature that was really useful. Finally, we had communication as another aspect of our simulation. Signal on this in this location is okay most of the time, but it's not something that we can rely on. But in the design of the analog mission, we purposefully delayed the communication. So we had communication latency. And we delayed that by approximately 20 minutes one way. And that's to simulate that a radio signal from Mars to get to planet Earth, it takes about 20 minutes roughly. So we simulated that message one way. We then needed some time for the mission control team to make a decision about that question that was being asked or that feedback that was being given. So that took 20 minutes, and then another 20 minutes for that message to go back. So the analog astronauts that were out on this mission, they knew they wouldn't get a reply for at least an hour. And this was the perfect simulation to make sure that the analog astronauts, they knew that they were on their own in terms of managing the risks to their own health, but also conducting the research they were tasked to do. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later on. So what I've got for you now is some drone footage of this location. So this was taken during our pilot mission. And you can see that the weather on this day was relatively kind to us, which, as I say, is quite unusual. And this is the location of the pilot mission analog astronaut base. For the mission that we did here in 2023, it was a slightly different location because the environment had changed in a particular way. So you can see that this island is relatively small, only sort of 1 kilometer wide by 2 kilometers in length. But within that small amount of space, you've got a huge variety of different types of environments. You've got crags and hills, you've got grassy plains, there are bog sections. There's certainly a lot of water around the island. And interestingly, one of the world's largest whirlpools is located very close off the shore of this island. And what you're probably thinking looking at this image is it doesn't really look like Mars. Unless we suddenly get to Mars and the other side of it is very green, I doubt that. But remember that no analog mission is perfect. We didn't want it to look like Mars. We wanted it to feel like another planet. Not necessarily Mars or the moon, but we wanted it to feel off-world, on another planet. And the data we collected about the evaluation of these analog missions that we've done so far is this is a really accurate, high fidelity, highly realistic environment to do this kind of research in. One of the final things I would say about the environment is most EVAs for human planetary exploration are planned to be no more than 2 kilometers in length. And you may remember that I said that the island itself is 2 kilometers. So from where the analog astronaut base camp is to the end of the island is 2 kilometers. And that may sound like a relatively short distance, but the analog astronauts in the room will know that it certainly takes a very long time to walk from the analog astronaut base camp here to the end of the island that you can see in this final shot. So this is a QR code that takes you to the program of research that we did in the analog mission in 2023 this summer. Some really fascinating, interesting research that took place. Everything from some amazing anthropology that looked at the experience of journeys and how that can affect people in space, but then also here on Earth as well. That was on the social science side. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we also did some physical science. We had a brilliant study from the University of Manchester, but they've developed a method of doing astrogeology. So how do you collect rock samples on another planet, done by a human, not done by a robot or machine learning or AI, but a human collecting these rock samples. And we tested that method, and it proved that this location is a really useful place to do that. Not only is the geology of this island relatively unknown and not mapped very accurately, as I said before, NASA were interested in rocks in this island chain, so the accuracy of that study was increased even more. And then finally, in terms of the research, we tested some remote health monitoring technology. So this was a study done from the University of Lancaster using smart rings, where the analog astronauts wore this all the time, and the data being collected was about heart rate variability, and using that as a way of measuring stress in these harsh environments. The environments not only being a simulation of space, but also being in a remote, rugged environment, knowing that getting off this place would be very challenging indeed. Finally, to say in the pilot analog mission, what we did was we didn't just want to do science and research. We wanted to bring that together with the arts. Because the arts are a universal language where you can share the information and the learning that we had from the science. So we won some funding for an artist in residence called Sarah, and she presented the work that she did as an artist at the World Geographical Society Explore Conference last year in 2022. And you can see a recording of her presentation on the RGS website. And again, I'd really encourage you to do that. So at this point, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask two of the analog astronauts that came on the mission in this summer to come up and share their experience. I was really pleased that we took 6 analog astronauts, 3 men, 3 women, from a completely different background, and they were absolutely fantastic, really putting a lot of effort into the research they were asked to do. And this was the final image when we stepped off the rocket that you can see in the background, the yellow powerboat, and they're still smiling, so I was really happy about that. So I'd like to ask Guidon and Jack to step up and to share some of their experiences as an analog astronaut.
Want to go first? Go first. All right. Yeah, thanks, Miles. So I was mission specialist on this mission, which was essentially comms, outreach, social media strategy, producing content, stuff like that. I think if you asked anyone when they were a child what they wanted to be when they grew up, a lot of people would say astronaut. But then you get to adulthood and reality kind of kicks in and it starts to become a goal that's not too attainable. But I think the curiosity you have when you're a child does stay with you. And it certainly did for me. And so the opportunity to be an analog astronaut and contribute to my curiosity and someone else's curiosity through the research that was being conducted was an excellent opportunity. And I think what being an analog astronaut meant to me was suffering through difficulties so that an astronaut in the future doesn't have to. And we definitely did suffer through some difficulties with getting sick of the food or insect bites or removing ticks from each other, which I'll spare you the details. But we hope that what we did will eventually mean that an astronaut has an easier time when they do it for real. And secondly was, as a professional, I come from a military background and I wanted to be the mission commander. Unfortunately, I didn't get that role. And at first I was offended. I was like, I've done this kind of stuff so many times. Why am I not the commander? And the role that Miles gave me was mission specialist, which was a completely new challenge, something I had never done before. And I think that in the end, that actually helped me grow more than it would if I had been the mission commander and doing something that was familiar to me, because I was doing something that was completely out of my comfort zone. And I was having to, come up with the ideas on the fly of something that I'd never done before. And I think that was a really rewarding experience. So yeah, I was very happy to do it. And I'll pass on to Gideon now.
Cheers, Jack. Hi, everyone. I'm Gideon. I work in the space industry at a company called Bryce Tech, who are an analytic consultancy. And I was the commander of the Melee 1 mission. Yeah, completely agree with everything that Jack said. I think on top of that, kind of learned a couple more things. The first thing was, I think it was really interesting to get sort of a first-hand understanding of some of the challenges, some of the joys, some of the frustrations that astronauts would face in a real mission. Miles said that we did a geological study on the mission. I was talking to an ESA astronaut a while ago, and the #1 skill that they all want in future missions is geology. So Jack can attest, there were days where it was fantastic because you get the results you want, and days where it's frustrating because you don't. And it was really interesting understanding that psychology. I think the other thing is to sort of understand what you can learn from a mission like this is to understand what we were doing, right? You're working in a very close-knit, multidisciplinary team. You're in an environment that is completely different to anything you would experience in your day-to-day life. You need to perform on complicated, unrelated tasks consistently and effectively. And it takes a lot of planning. It's tough physically and mentally. And all of that sort of comes together to mean that you're going to learn a lot in a very short period of time about yourself, about how you work with other people, about how you lead other people. I learned personally a lot about myself as a leader, what I do well, what I can do better, and I carried that out into the rest of my life. I'm in the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, and doing something like this is sort of excellent experience to carrying over into roles like that as well. I think you see that in actual astronauts as well, like Mark Kelly, I don't know if you guys know him. He was a NASA astronaut, now a senator. Mike Alegria Lopez, he commanded the first Axiom mission. And before that, he was a NASA astronaut, and he led the Commercial Spaceflight Federation in the US for a while. So I think experiences like this, whether it's an analog mission or a real mission, people bring that experience back with them in a very unique skill set. And I hope that as there's more missions like this analog mission, but also as more people go out into space, you're going to get those people bringing back those skill sets to benefit us on Earth as well. So yeah, that was my experience. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing those reflections. So coming towards the end of my presentation, so how do you get involved and what are the futures of analog missions in the UK? Well, one of the studies that we did during the mission this year was an evaluation study from the European Space Agency, who tested some technology about health monitoring again, so using ultrasound, portable ultrasound devices. And that study really is setting up for a series of studies about using technology during spaceflight, which will most likely be used on Gateway, which is the replacement for the International Space Station. So that study will take place again. So we're now in the planning stages of MAILI 2, which will take place in the summer 2024. So we're going to open up a call for research proposals later next month, December 2023, for that mission. We've got the dates there, we've got them in the diary already. So we've booked our 2 weeks in space again. The same location, and as I said earlier, there was a note on the slide, the exact location is being kept secret. So we can do all of the exploration of this location, of this analog mission in a really high fidelity environment. We're also going to be recruiting analog astronauts and members of the mission control team in defined roles, and that's based on the research that is proposed in December. So as Gideon and Jack alluded to, there's a selection process and a rigorous training process before going on the mission, and this is to simulate the same experience that astronauts have in becoming an astronaut as well, and that will take place from spring 2024. And then lastly, what we're going to do is open up the training program for people to take part in training weekends and activities. So you can try some of this research that analog astronauts are doing for yourself. So this is part of our STEM and STEAM outreach education program. So this is all to say thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you to the organisations that made it possible for us to do this analog mission. I'm really looking forward to the next mission. And if you've got any questions after this presentation, the QR code on the screen takes you to my LinkedIn profile, and my email address is on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miles. We have an excellent question in the Q&A for Erica, and we can start off the panel with that. But in the meantime, are there any questions for Miles? We could take one in the room and one online.
You feel sort of going back to the same location. I mean, how does that? Do you think that maybe takes away a bit from sort of some of the novelty of going somewhere those challenges you might face, or does it create interesting sort of new challenges?
That's a really good question. So just to make sure everyone online heard it, the question is, if going back to the same location, does that limit the simulation in any way? And the answer to that is it depends on what we're simulating. If we're simulating a second space mission to a same location, it's a perfect analog, because we're going back to an environment where we've collected some data, whether it's geological or whether it's about human performance, but we've only scratched the surface. This island is relatively small, but there is so much more data that we can collect. So doing an analog mission to the same location gives us a lot more information. However, doing it in a different location is really easy to do as well. We've got this central analog mission design that can be deployed to environments that have similarities with space. So if we need research in a different location, that's easily done as well. Great question.
Excellent, thank you. Nothing on the Q&A, so we'll thank Miles again. And now we can head over to listen to Robert Zubrin, who's kindly joined us. He is president of the Mars Society and author, including of The Case for Mars and The New World on Mars, What We Can Create on the Red Planet, which is coming out in early 2024. So thank you, Robert. Over to you. And please unmute yourself, Robert.
Hello. Thank you very much. By the way, I'll be visiting the UK in January, from January 13th through 29th. I'll be speaking at Leeds on January 27th, at the University of Edinburgh, January 24th. I think at the British Interplanetary Society around January 18th. And who knows, maybe we can have an event at your university. We'll see. In any case, yeah, I have a new book coming out called The New World on Mars. And it has, and I have, a very different perspective on the human venture into space than was voiced by Erica. And certainly, I have to say, I strongly disagree with many of the things she said, and I'm extremely grateful that prior generations did not share the skepticism of the idea of progress that she mentioned. But let me just give you my perspective here. Okay, first of all, yes, we have a revolution in spaceflight going on right now, and it's been spearheaded by Elon Musk and SpaceX, but it's gotten much bigger than that. And there are numerous launch companies. The SpaceX cut the cost of space launch by a factor of 5 over the past decade. That's made all sorts of space business plans viable. The more space business plans that are viable, the more launches there are, the cheaper launch becomes, and the more launch companies get into the game. The cheaper launch becomes, the less conservative spacecraft designers need to be, and therefore you rapidly accelerate the rate of spacecraft technology advance, which makes still more space ventures viable. And this is just a self-feeding virtuous cycle at this point. And now there's an additional point. The fact that we're going to have reusable launch vehicles means that there's soon going to be a market in used launch vehicles, which is something with profound implications. You know, the new cars are expensive, much too expensive for most people on Earth to afford. And yet, I don't know if most people, but quite a large section of the human population owns cars. And how do they do it? Because they buy used cars, so it costs 1/10 or less of the price of a new car. There's going to be used space launch vehicles. So it's going to be possible for people with much more modest levels of funding than is now required to go into space, and including to launch ventures of establishing humanity on Mars. Now, we do not get to plan this. Okay, we have no right to plan it, and we have no ability to plan it. People are going to do it. And my perspective is that there won't be one Mars city like Elon Musk talks about building a giant Mars city. There'll be dozens of Mars cities established by people with very different ideas on what the ideal society should be. And this will be sorted out, which ones become the prevalent form of human society on Mars will be sorted out not by planners, but by natural selection. Okay, that is, world's history is the world's court. Okay, which are the colonies that are going to outgrow the others? Well, I can tell you one feature about them. They're going to be the ones that are the most attractive to immigrants. They will outgrow the others. And what features will they need to have, okay, in order to attract large numbers of immigrants? Well, they'll need political liberty, okay, because people are not going to immigrate to an extraterrestrial tyranny. So all these anti-utopias that are featured widely in science fiction about the tyrannies on Mars are impossible. You could have one, but it would be stillborn. The dominant forms of society is going to be those that attract the most immigrants, and therefore, yes, offer the highest pay. And what one thing that Erica said about the settlement of America was 180 degrees wrong. It opened up increased exploitation, and quite the opposite. The settlement of America, the reason why immigrants came to America is because, as harsh as the conditions that they lived in as seen from today, from the point of view of their own time, okay, the highest pay was to be found in America. And America, because yes, America had a severe labor shortage, and therefore it got into gadgeteering and to labor-saving devices. Now, what is a labor-saving device? A labor-saving device is actually a labor productivity multiplying device. Okay, and that means it's a standard of living increasing device because the average amount of product available per person to consume on average equals the average amount of product available that each person produces. Okay, so America became a nation of invention. And by so doing, it benefited not just the immigrants, okay, who, after all, represented only a tiny fraction of the total European population, with far more people remained in Europe than came to America, but yet, nevertheless, vastly benefited Europe because you created this culture of invention, which British invented steam engines, Americans invented the steamboat. Okay, first steamboat, the Perseverance, demonstrated the Constitutional Congress in 1787, and the first practical steamboat, the Clermont. Okay. On the Hudson River, financed by Robert Livingston, the man who negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, but steamboats, telegraphs, electric light bulbs, centrally generated electric power, recorded sound, motion pictures, airplanes, the nuclear power, television, the home computers, the internet, iPhones. Okay, this is a culture of invention. Now Mars is going to be a culture of invention. It has to be. There's going to be tremendous challenges on Mars. There's going to be a tremendous labor shortage, so they're going to be absolute aggressive pioneers in areas not only of labor-saving machinery, but robotics and artificial intelligence. There is a shortage of not of land, but of arable land on Mars. It's hard to create arable land on Mars, and so they're going to push biotechnology. They're going to make it possible to grow 10 or 100 times as much food on a given acre of land as you can do on Earth. And in fact, the Mars Society, which I lead, has established a Mars Technology Institute to start creating businesses oriented around these challenges. And if we can create technologies that meet these challenges, we're going to vastly improve the human condition on Earth. We're going to make meat 10 times cheaper than it is now because you'll be able to produce it without either the cow or the cornfield. And then energy, okay. The Martians, there's no fossil fuels on Mars. Solar energy is weak. Wind is weak. You won't have hydroelectric until the planet is terraformed. They're going to have to be pioneers in advanced nuclear power and fusion. These are all inventions that they will make for themselves, in which they will license on Earth in order to profit from the patents and pay for their imports. But the creation of those inventions will benefit Earth in extraordinary ways. And also they will be pioneers in social forms. Because look, you know, what is the dominant form of oppression in the world's advanced nations today? I'm not talking about third world tyrannies, okay? We can easily see what the problems there are. What are the problems in our own society? I would say that the dominant form of oppression in our own society is oppression of the uncertified, denial of opportunity to people who do not have appropriate degrees, which is basically an enormous poll tax because these degrees are extremely expensive to get, and both in terms of outright cash and loss of time that could be spent working and other such things. Martians are not going to have any patience for keeping people out of professions that they're capable of doing. Okay, they won't, because they'll have a labor shortage. They won't be able to afford it. And so I believe that just as America was able to pioneer the more liberal social forms than were prevalent in Europe. I'm using liberal in the generic term sense of the word, not in the sense of the current American political spectrum or this sort of thing. That is, they took the ideas of 18th century liberalism, which in fact were, of course, generated in Europe, okay, by John Locke and other British and French thinkers, but couldn't be implemented in Europe. But by going to a new place where the rules hadn't been written yet, they had a chance to give these ideas a spin. And it's not true that we took all the problems of the old world to America. We took some of them, but not all of them. Okay, we did have a new start. Okay, There has been, for instance, religious prejudice in America, to be sure, but there has never been a religious war or even a serious religious persecution. We have class distinction in America, but we never had blood nobility. So by going to a new place, people were able to try to bring all the best and leave at least some of the worst behind. And this is what you have an opportunity of doing with a new start. Now, to be clear, by the way, I do not think the idea of going to Mars to have a second home for humanity so that when the Earth is destroyed, there'll be some survivors elsewhere is a valid argument. I find it a repugnant argument. It's absurd. And yeah, morally repugnant. We are not going to space to desert the Earth. We are going to space to protect the Earth and to enhance the capability of the human race to deal with all challenges, including not only asteroids, but all the challenges that technology can deal with, which is all challenges, because you're going to have a new and inventive branch of human civilization there, okay? Some of the cures for COVID that were developed when the epidemic broke out were developed in Europe. Others were developed in America. We added our inventive capability to that of the older part of Western civilization, and by so doing, strengthened all of human civilization's ability to protect itself. Now, there is another side to this as well. Okay, what is the real threat facing humanity today? Okay. If I'd asked this question in 2019 or so, everybody would have said the global warming. There's still a few people that would say that, but it's pretty clear right now that the real threat facing humanity is war. And the reason why there's a threat of war is not because of a shortage of resources. It is because of the idea that resources are finite. This idea that there is not enough to go around for everyone is the main threat to humanity. It was the main threat in the 20th century when the cause of both world wars, in the ultimate cause, and of the Holocaust, the Holodomor, and other horrific things. And it's the threat to us now. But it was all fictitious, okay? World War II was not caused by climate change. World War II, contrary to Hitler, was not caused by a resource shortage. Germany never needed living space. Okay, Germany today is smaller than the Third Reich and has a larger population, but a vastly higher standard of living. Why? Because of the advance of science and technology, which has been a global project contributed to by many nations, including very notably groups that the Nazis were trying to exterminate. If they had been successful in winning their war, Germans would be much poorer today. But yeah, Germans participated too, but so did the Jews, who they were trying to wipe out. So did the Poles, they were trying to wipe out, and others that they were trying to enslave. And but people don't see that. And I happen to know for a fact that there are people in the American national security establishment in senior positions who believe that war with China is inevitable. Why? Because there's 1.4 billion of them, and if they all start driving cars like Westerners, there won't be enough oil in the world. And you could bet your bottom dollar that they have counterparts in Beijing who look at the world from the other side of the chessboard and think comparable thoughts, but with the other side in mind as the victor. And and if this kind of zero-sum thinking is allowed to prevail, we're headed for another world war. Okay, we are, so this kind of zero-sum thinking has to be defeated. Now, we're not going to get oil from Mars. Okay, no. We may get, I believe we will get plentiful inventions from Mars, which will expand human resources. And this is another very important point. There's no such thing as a natural resource. There's only natural raw materials. It is human creativity manifested as technology that turns materials into resources. Okay, uranium wasn't a resource till we invented nuclear power. Oil wasn't a resource till we invented oil drilling and refining and things that could run on the product. Land wasn't even a resource until people invented agriculture. Okay, the resources are human creations. Okay, and if we can go to Mars, okay, and make it clear that resources are human creations, that a barren planet can be turned into a place where humans can flourish, that by working together we can create planets, that there's no point killing each other fighting over provinces. Okay, so that is how space protects us. And the effort to try to ban humanity from space, which is being pushed by David Dudeney and these Wiener Schmitz, who wrote this recent destructive book called City on Mars, this is what threatens humanity. If you want to get two people fighting over a cup of water, all you have to do is lock them in the room and tell them there's no way out, and that's the only cup of water they're ever going to see. Then you'll get murder for a cup of water. But if they understand that the doors are open, okay, there's no reason to kill each other fighting over cups of water, okay, because the door is open. There's no reason fighting over the earth if the earth comes with an infinite sky. It's wide open, okay? And then finally, I would have to say this, okay, that while opening the sky, okay, is our best bet to undermine the tyrants who are pushing war. Because yes, who wants war? Tyrants want war because the fundamental justification for tyranny is the putative necessity of war. And the fundamental justification for the thesis that war is always necessary is the putative limitation of resources. You overthrow the theory of limited resources, you overthrow the theory that war is necessary. And if you overthrow the theory that war is necessary, you overthrow the theory that tyrants is necessary. You know, Adolf Hitler said, and this is a close quote, of course, he said it in German. He said, the idea of perpetual human prosperity through progress is a Jewish plot to undermine the people's belief in the necessity for war. Now, it is not a Jewish plot, but it does undermine people's belief in the necessity for war. And that is why, okay, in this war of ideas, this is the idea that we have to fight for. And this is the idea for which space exploration is the decisive weapon. Okay, see, because look, it's not true that the resources of the Earth are finite. They're not. The resources of the Earth are infinite. Okay, I know that probably seems counterfactual to you, but the resources of the Earth have been growing exponentially as technology has been advancing. Okay, and there are far more resources available to each person on Earth today than there were 100 years ago, or even 30 years ago, and to say nothing of 1,000 years ago, when the populations were much lower. Why? Because science has advanced. But nevertheless, to try to convince people that the resources of the Earth are infinite is like trying to convince a mathematically illiterate person that there can be an infinite number of points in a line segment that is 1 centimeter long. Okay, there are, but they won't believe that. On the other hand, they will believe that there's an infinite number of points in a line that goes infinitely off in both directions. And that's the point. We're not going to get oil from Mars. We will get inventions from Mars, but the most important thing we're going to get from Mars is the truth. The truth. The truth is that resources are infinite, that resources are human creations, that resources are created by inventions, and the more inventors, the more inventions, and therefore the nations of the world are not, as the fascists would claim, in a struggle for existence over limited resources, but are fundamentally a family. A very disorderly family at the moment, one must say, but nevertheless a family which is engaged in a joint project of expanding the resources available to humanity through invention. It is not true that America's the high standard of living is impoverishing China. Exactly the opposite is true. And it's not just because they're selling to Americans and thus enormously increasing their standard of living. It's because America and the West more broadly, if you want to be completely inclusive, is responsible for all the inventions, ranging from electricity to iPhones that have vastly increased the Chinese standard of living over the past 3 decades. But if you go further back, it was Chinese inventions, including paper and printing, that made possible the Western Renaissance. So we owe our prosperity to them. They owe their prosperity to us. and this is how it is, because inventions made anywhere ultimately become used by everyone everywhere. So we need a new inventive branch of human civilization, and that's what we're going to get. Again, going to get many new inventive branches of human civilization by going into space. Okay, because going into space, having places where the slate is clean, where we can start afresh, and where ideas can be given a run. Now, not all these ideas are going to be good ideas, and those colonies will fail. Okay, but the ideas that are better, that do offer people a better way to realize the human potential than anything they can do on Earth, they are the ones that will attract the immigrants. And we're going to see a new standard set for human societies, just as America, okay, for all its imperfection, okay, you know, had its founding, and even today, okay, but certainly in the 19th century, nevertheless, set a higher standard. And so, for instance, countries today all either are or try to pretend that they are democracies. Okay, even those that are not democracies try to pretend they have democracies and human rights. Okay, because that's the standard. That's the standard that was set. Okay, and some have met it, some have perhaps exceeded it, but it was set at the frontier, and it propagated back into the rest of the West and then the rest of the world. Okay, and you know, this is what we're going to achieve. We're going to achieve an advance in the human condition by having not utopia. Mars will never be a utopia, because wherever people go, people will bring conflict between them. They'll bring all the problems that human nature brings with it. Okay, but it will be not utopias, but laboratories, experiments. The founders of the United States called their project a noble experiment. Okay, and it ultimately proved out, and millions of people voted with their feet to come here. On Mars, we're going to have a chance to do a multitude of additional noble experiments. Okay. And then finally, I do want to mention one thing, because people will say, well, what about the militarization of space? Okay, does not create a new domain in which conflict can occur. Yeah, it does, and that is a good thing. Okay, and in fact, if it wasn't for space assets right now, okay, of communication satellites, reconnaissance satellites, GPS guided munitions, millions of people currently alive in Ukraine would be dead, because the country would be have been conquered, and it would have been crushed and been subject to Russian genocide. Okay, and and frankly, if the air had not been militarized, Europe today would be ruled by either Nazi Germany or communist Russia. Okay, because see, the fact of the matter is that when a new, more challenging domain for human activity is opened for war, it always benefits the more liberal societies. Okay, because it is the more liberal societies that have the inventiveness needed to develop capabilities. And this goes back, in fact, to Athens. Sea power was always dominated by the more liberal societies, from Athens to the British Navy. It was always the case. And then air power, while sure, the military potentials of air power were first demonstrated by Germany and Japan, they were quickly exceeded by the Anglo-Americans, who did more with air power, far more than those guys ever did. And while space, okay, the first satellite was communist Russia, but we rapidly showed that the free society could do much more with space than they could. Okay, so space, human expansion into space, is our best chance of avoiding war, and it is absolutely essential to prevail in that war should it eventually happen. Okay, so I'm for progress, I'm for space, I'm for Mars. Thanks. I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate it. Although I must admit, I've seen Moonraker, so I think that Space and War in Space may... Oh no, that's science fiction. Sorry, not reality. There was actually an excellent summary comment in the chat, so thank you. There's been a lot of interesting content with regards to what and whether there should be a future in colonization. It would be interesting to see Robert and Erica debate in the future, and definitely wonderful to have the different opinions, different viewpoints. And we do have time for perhaps one question to Robert.
All right, well, by the way, with respect to that, I would greatly enjoy debating Erica in a more formal debate, with the opening statements, rebuttals, and then questions from the audience. And perhaps we could do that at University College London while I'm in the UK in January. How about it? You game, Erica?
Certainly an option, and obviously online and hybrid is working too, so it could be possible that way. Please go ahead.
Could I ask a question to both Robert and Erica?
Okay, go ahead. Although if we're going to the panel, there was one question in the Q&A.
I'll save it then. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we go ahead then? So I'll start with the question to Eric, and then we'll go to you, to both of them. So, very nice talk. Do you think that some of the work on the ethics of space inadvertently gives credibility to unrealistic grand proposals by some controversial space entrepreneurs? For example, rightly questioning what the labor rights will be on Mars, still accepts that there will be a workforce on Mars that has not died of radiation or something else first. One can argue that the latter is more likely, at least in the near future. I'm interested in your opinion as you're both an astronomer and space ethics expert. Please, Erica, go ahead.
If Erica's
She's
not
having
going to
trouble.
answer,
Yeah,
I'd be happy to answer.
she is having trouble. Hopefully she will come back. Perhaps, yes, please go ahead with your question and we'll get Robert to answer and then Erica.
I'd be happy to answer the question you just asked.
Okay, please go ahead. And Miles, do you want to come up and then also respond?
Okay,
Please,
so
go ahead.
once again, the labor laws and such that they'll be on Mars will be determined by the Mars city-states themselves. And those city-states that want to grow will have labor laws that make them attractive places for working people to go to. And as far as the radiation is concerned, that's nonsense. It's very easy to shield the people from radiation. In fact, the radiation levels on the surface of Mars are about the same as that at the space station. And if you spend, 3/4 of your time underground, since you'd have the habitations underground, you'd be shielded there, and so your radiation level would be 1/4 of that at the space station, which would not have any effects whatsoever.
Miles, any thoughts?
I mean, I'm not an ethics expert at all, but I would say that it needs careful consideration, all of those ethical dilemmas, and thoughtful and respectful debate as well. And I think, Robert, you kind of alluded to that with your invitation to a debate. So, yeah, really interesting thought there.
Please go ahead.
Sure. Can I hear me?
Robert can. Erica
Okay.
is not online at the moment. I'm just trying to see if she's able to join us again.
Sure. So yeah, Robert, thanks very much for your presentation. It's great to see you present again. I was actually at the opening event of the Mars Society in the UK, so it's good to see you on screen at least again. I can see Eric has joined as well.
Excellent.
So yeah, my question to both Erica and Robert is, Erica mentioned the Outer Space Treaty and its prohibitions against seizing territory in space. I think it's not controversial to say that on Earth, a lack of private property rights is pretty inimical to any economic activity. There's sort of pretty interesting studies in developing nations of land ownership structures, which move from systems where there's very uncertain ownership to certain legal ownership, and you can see the individuals living there being able to capitalize and gain from their land, and that leading to economic prosperity. So my question is, do you think it's only a matter of time that nations abandon the provisions in the Outer Space Treaty prohibiting seizure of territory? It's sort of an artifact of the Cold War. Maybe it requires us to leave sort of the Cold War-like state that we're living in today. But yeah, is it a matter of time before that prohibition is ignored or removed?
So I'll go with Erica, Robert, and Miles. Erica.
So my microphone is hopefully working again. I've had to change computers.
broke down right in the middle. I apologize for missing the previous question, which I'm happy to answer as well. This is a great question. I will say that the space lawyers and policymakers I've talked to are quite attached to the Outer Space Treaty. While there are a few arguing that we should get rid of it or replace it or enhance it, most of them are focused more on how to continue increasing our activities in space within the confines of the Outer Space Treaty. One example in particular I'll point to is the US and both the Artemis Accords and the Space Act of 2015 have really focused on sidestepping the prohibition against appropriation of territory, but allowing private ownership of resources that a company would extract from the moon or Mars, which would then allow those companies to sell those resources and thus stimulate the American space industry and others. That seems to really be the focus of the US government for the past few years, which I think the goal there is to get all of the benefits of private property in the sense that it's incentivizes development, but avoids the appropriation of territory. Now that still leads to a lot of questions about, that still sets up land use conflicts in particular. And that's why the Artemis Accords in particular are focused on safety zones and really digging into the prohibition against harmful interference and harmful contamination outlined by the treaty. So the details remain to be worked out, of course, but at the moment, it seems that the approach, at least taken by the Western governments, is to get the good things from private property in terms of stimulating the economy while trying to avoid a land war.
Robert.
There is a need for private property rights in space, and the Outer Space Treaty has created certain obstacles to it, though not necessarily. The treaty could be revised in the future. No one can tell about that. But if we talk about how things are under the Outer Space Treaty, yeah, it does ban claims of national sovereignty by its signatories on other worlds. And that is about 114 countries are signatories, including all the spacefaring countries. And there's about 80 that aren't, which are not spacefaring countries, but do include countries that have excellent launch sites on them. Now, it does not, contrary to the Wiener Smiths, ban people who are not signatories from establishing new nations on, for instance, Mars. Okay, quite the contrary. It bans the signatories from interfering in that because they have no sovereignty there. Now, once there are Martian city-states, for example, they will unquestionably establish property rights for the territories within their purview, and that'll be fine. But we need a form of property before that happens. And I've proposed a form of property law based on patent law. Okay, the US Patent Office, and I've had a lot of dealings with them because I'm an inventor. I have about 20 patents. And drive me up the wall a lot of times. But nevertheless, that said, this has been a great institution for humanity because what it has allowed inventors to do from any country, including, like, say, from Sweden. Okay, you can get a Swedish patent, a lot of good that'll do you, but a Swede can go to the US Patent Office and get a US patent, and he's got the rights to 25% of the world economy. And if someone wants to use his invention, they'll probably want to do business with him. Well, similarly, if we set up a space mining patents office in the United States, okay, or it could be done internationally, either way is fine with me, but the Luxembourg set it up and everybody else could recognize it. Where what it basically says is if you go and survey an asteroid to some specified degree of detail and you publish the data, just like a patent requires you to publish your invention, okay, then you get the rights to mine that asteroid for a specified period of time. A US patent is 18 years. This kind of patent might be 99 years. Okay, but if you had that, then you could finance asteroid exploration today privately based on the speculative value of those claims. Okay, that is, there's no one who can actually mine asteroids right now. The technology does not exist. And this is why there were several asteroid mining companies set up in the past decade that all failed. It wasn't possible. But if there was a law that allowed you to explore asteroids and stake a claim based on the published data, then you could get financing for asteroid exploration. This asteroid exploration is possible today. And this would benefit science. We get a massive data return that would be available to the public. And if the claims were there, and it was known that a particular asteroid had particularly rich claims, that would incentivize the development of the technology to develop those claims. And then those materials, which right now are not resources for humanity, would become resources for humanity. This is how we expand the resources of humanity. Look, you take all the houses in the United Kingdom, how much are they worth? Well, probably some very large number. They wouldn't be worth a nickel or a pound, a penny. You guys have pennies. If there weren't property titles to them. Your house would be worth zero if you did not have a property title to it, because no matter how personally formidable you may be, 4 or 5 guys would come and throw you out of your house. Okay, so you could not sell your house. You couldn't, it would have no commercial value. The reason why those houses have value is because there's a property title to them. Asteroid materials will have value once there are property titles attached to them. And this is fundamental to being able to develop them. Okay, fundamentally. Do you know why the buffalo in the United States were exterminated? Because nobody owned them. Nobody owned them. Think about this for a minute. You've got Western pioneers, generally fairly poor people. They might have had 10 head of cattle that they're taking with them across the prairie to their new home, and they'd spend a lifetime to try to breed it up to 100 head. Meantime, there's 60 million buffalo roaming the prairies, okay, which are superior meat to cow beef and require less care. And they're just wiped out because nobody could put a brand on them. Because instead of being considered property, they were considered wildlife, okay? If you want to develop a resource, someone has to own it. I think that using patent law, we can create a workaround that can exist even with the Outer Space Treaty in place.
Yeah, really interesting points. I mean, what I think is that space governance is a term and an area that is relatively unlooked at, just by the 2 key points that Erica and Robert have just made. I don't have the answers to that. But what I would say is that at UCL, we're considering these kind of challenges. So one of my roles at UCL is we have an ESA lab, European Space Agency lab here at UCL, that's made up of 13 different themes. Each of those themes has a head. My role is chairperson of that Head Space Themes Committee. And one of the new themes that we've just created in the last couple of weeks actually is space governance. So we're currently designing a series of events similar to this that will take place in 2024, going into 2025, to look at some of these really interesting and challenging topics. So keep an eye on our website for those events coming up next year.
Erica, do you want to answer that first question? Do you have access to it?
It's disappeared off my screen, but I think I remember. It was asking about whether talking about things like labor rights provides support for perhaps physically unfeasible planning that's going on right now, which I think is an excellent question. I am more skeptical about technological feasibility in the near term than some of the people who are actively trying to get investment in their near term technology, which is understandable. And perhaps it's true that I'm providing unreasonable support by talking about these future social problems, which rely on having a bunch of people living in space. However, I still think it's an exercise worth having, and I talk about this a lot. I don't think that sustainable space settlement is going to exist within my lifetime, just based on the practical and technological challenges before us. I do think it will happen eventually, but I think it's still worth having these kinds of discussions, because if nothing else, imagining how and debating how we would want to build a new society in space really helps us talk about the issues that we're having in our societies today in a new light. It's very hard to, if we have an imagined vision of how we want our society to operate, sometimes it's extremely challenging to think about how we would get there from here and the challenges that we have today. But if we're thinking about how we would create a new society from scratch, it lets us imagine much more radical solutions than we would be able to on Earth right now. And so just for that reason alone, I think it's a good exercise to discuss and debate what kinds of societies we would want to see in the future. So that's my answer to that question. It's an excellent question.
Thank you. So we've one question online, and then we'll take one last one in the room. Given current space law of the Outer Space Treaty and national responsibility for space ventures, how likely is it that initial space settlements will have latitude in defining their situation? And I'll go Robert, Miles, and Erica. So Robert, please.
Well, actually, the Outer Space Treaty, because it bans claims of national sovereignty on other planets, will give human beings who go there complete freedom to establish their own nations. That is, the United States, the UK, Russia, China has no right whatsoever to interfere with Mars settlers.
Miles.
My take on that, which is a great question, is the environment itself will have a lot to say in some way. So based on the work that we've done, training to be in these environments is particularly challenging, and you can't mitigate all of those risks to 100%. So that environment will be particularly challenging. So that's something to consider.
Erica.
The interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty given to me by space lawyers points out that while nations can't appropriate territory in space, the Outer Space Treaty does say that anyone launching from one of the signatories or a citizen of one of the signatories still has to follow the laws of their launching state, which is why Americans launched into space have to get FAA licenses to launch, for example. And so if the first space settlement happens under that regime, then they're technically by the Outer Space Treaty, people will still have to follow the laws and the regulations set down by the countries they launched from. Now, the question is both whether those countries will still be able to enforce those laws. Certainly, if you are living in space, but you have a lot of assets back on Earth, it's a lot easier to have those laws enforced upon you. However, if you've just packed up everything you own and moved to space, that's a different story. And outside of the law, all the other activities that we do that aren't really following under any specific regulation, that is going to be shaped much more by local governance, local cultures and norms, and as Miles mentioned, that's going to be shaped really heavily by the physical environment that we're living in at the time.
And final questions.
Yeah. My question was, Robert, you alluded to some colonies will fail.
Mm-hmm.
What practically is a failing colony? What happens when a colony fails? And ethically, do you rescue a failing colony? How do you rescue a failing colony? Because that might mean they're not profitable, maybe, or it could mean that their air production has failed and they're running out of oxygen. It's a unique risk in space. So what do you do in that situation?
Well, okay. There's already existing agreements, both written and just understood, that you give help to people in distress in space, just as you do on the high seas, and you do that whether or not there's some specific agreement to do so. Okay. When I was talking about, so yeah, if an emergency happens due to a structural failure or people will try to rescue the imperiled group as best they can. But I was talking about colonies failing more in the economic realm. That is, that immigrants don't go there. So it withers on the vine, or the people that are there move out because they find another colony much more attractive. Or it goes bankrupt. These are other ways in which something could fail. And these colonies, in other words, colonies that make themselves unattractive to immigrants, will fail. Colonies, you could have a kind of a colony which, for instance, limits itself to people from a particular ethnic and religious background. There's even some points to be made in favor of that in terms of reinforcing social solidarity, but any such colony would remain small because it can only draw from a narrow group of people. In my book, I go through that and why I believe the model will be the melting pot on Mars, to be able to draw from the most of the human race and but you do need to forge a common identity because social solidarity will be needed in a Mars colony. But yeah, look, if you look at the New World, okay, and some of this can be pretty messy. Okay, I mentioned we had a noble experiment in the United States. We did, but actually there were two big experiments done in the United States. Okay, there was the North, which pioneered the model of high-paid labor using advanced technology, backed up by public education, to become a culture of invention, increasing the power of labor, the productivity of labor through invention. But there's another way to deal with a labor shortage, and that was what was done in the South, and that was slavery. Okay, and these two models were incompatible. As Lincoln said, 1858, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe this nation can persist half slave and half free. Okay, now the North won. Okay, and now if you ask Civil War buffs, why did the North win the Civil War? They would say, well, it had a larger population and a lot more industry. That's true. Why did it have a larger population and a lot more industry? Because all the immigrants went to the North. The Union Army was 40% immigrants of first-generation Americans. The Confederate Army, the South, 3%. Hardly any immigrants would want to go to a place where they had to compete with slave labor. Okay, so that's why the House divided was settled that way. It's conceivable to me that, you know, you could have an unfree power, China maybe, establish a forced labor colony on Mars, but it certainly won't attract immigrants. The ones that grow will be the ones that offer people something better.
Erica, any thoughts? And then we'll conclude with Miles.
I think this is an excellent question, because the question of what the definition of a failed colony is, I think does affect the ethics. If a failed settlement, as Bob describes it, is this the same way as a failed company, then you know, the most that's lost is the investment and perhaps the people whose jobs are lost. The question, of course, is what does that look like on the ground in the settlement itself when the company goes under? Are people automatically guaranteed a trip back to Earth? There's been some discussion in the rooms I've been in about whether we need to establish some kind of right of return. What happens if you lose your job in space? And so if it's a matter of, well, everybody just goes home to Earth and tries again, then these experiments, I think, are much more ethically justifiable. If a failed settlement looks more like some of the failures of colonies in North America, where it fails because everybody dies or starves to death, then of course that's a different story. As a scientist, a physical scientist, not a political scientist, I still love the idea of these settlements being laboratories. However, I'll point out that non-physical scientists, the ones who work on these social problems, do have to contend with IRB boards and think about the effects of running experiments with humans inside your laboratories. And that's something we have to consider, and especially in terms of what the failure state looks like. So I think it's a great question to keep in mind.
Miles.
So firstly, this isn't such an alien concept. We have environments like this here on Earth. So high altitude mountaineering up in the Himalayas. This is an environment where there's an unwritten rule that you need to be able to look after yourself in this environment, because it's exceptionally difficult to evacuate people from these extreme locations. So there's definitely an analogy with space and these environments here on Earth. And this is something that I looked at in my PhD. So how do you manage these risks? Well, firstly, they're not compartmentalized. One risk feeds into another. So you need to be able to map the risk landscape, which involves identifying the risks that are relative to time, place, person, and activity. And once you've got a good idea about how that risk landscape looks, you need to be able to develop risk mitigation strategies. But those strategies aren't good enough if you just develop them and leave them as a paper exercise. You then need to be able to train them and test them to their limits and beyond, so you know the point of failure. And that way you can put in the mechanisms to manage that risk in an effective way. And that's what I can say to that question. Thank you.
No, wonderful conclusion for this seminar. Please, let's thank our speakers.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Book comes out in February. And once again, I'm coming to the UK January 13th through 29th. And I'd be grateful for an opportunity to give a talk at the university, or if Erica is up for it, a debate. Either way.
And I'll hand over to Rowan for a vote of thanks.
Once again, thank you very much for coming. Clearly a huge amount to debate there. And I think that along with things like AI and biotech, these are debates and discussions that we will be having probably for the rest of our lives in terms of the developmental path. So thank you for coming. Brilliant to hear from all of you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much to the Human Security Centre, to University College London, and especially Trona and Miles, and to Erica and Robert. Thank you so much.